psychologist, a sociologist, that the thing about violence, and this is what all disciplines would agree, is that it has patterns. It has internal codes of organizing. There are different forms of violence, like if we think of instrumental violence, where violence is a deliberate choice is made around using violence to achieve a certain goal. And I think we've seen many of these things, of these patterns and these features over the last 10 days. And I think and in the question time, we can go into it in a bit more detail. And I think it's always, in a way, there's always a dialectic in violence and confrontation between two different forces. And the key elements in the outcome of determining what the outcome is of that interaction is weapons, the numbers, and as well as in the appetite for violence. And again, if you can just use some of those elements to think about what has been happening over the last 10 days, I think it helps us begin to get some idea of some of the patterns of what's been happening. So my three key observations. Number one is to ask the question, what do we understand and accept as what is a measure of successful defense of property? We need to ask that question. Do we accept that life and the loss of life might be a necessary cost we have to pay to defend property and infrastructure, and significant infrastructure? Is it legitimate? Is it necessary? And whose life are we willing to sacrifice in order to defend property? So that's a question we really have to grapple with. And we need to be looking at who gets killed and who does the killing. So we know that just an hour ago, the latest number, 337 people killed. Of those, over 60% are murders. 213 people, there are murder dockets opened. 124 are inquests, which means the death is seen as unintentional. We know very little else about those numbers, whether how many were gunshots, what other kind of deaths ensued. But that's just to kind of give you a picture of, again, bringing us back to the question of, what is the measure of a successful defense of property? And if the loss of life is seen as a kind of collateral, then what are we unleashing into our society? So second observation is what I call the weapons effect. And I don't really have to go into too much detail, is we saw many, many examples, whether through photographs, through media reporting, of civilians organizing, mobilizing at community level in order to protect both private and public property. Many were armed, not all. And we've seen again that there seem to be kind of both race and class differences in terms of what kinds of weapons were mobilized by civilians protecting against a perceived threat. And of course, it took various forms. We have examples. I mean, Yeovil was one. We know the Glenwood example where civilians were working with SAPS and under the instruction of SAPS. In other instances, there was no collaboration with SAPS. It was people acting just within the community. And then, of course, there were several examples of nonviolent resistance, where people use some of the same mobilizing tactics of getting people together to protect malls. We saw that in Bertram's, what's called natural surveillance with the grannies of Bertram's. We saw that in examples in Mpumalanga. What we did see as well is that in some instances, the presence of armed groups act as a deterrent. But that's a temporary reprieve. So we saw that at Maponya Mall. We saw that at several other malls, and in particular in some communities in KZN. So the temporary reprieve is that the looting was stopped, but until it doesn't. And this is a key thing in criminology. So this thing of using increased security, increased numbers, increased weaponry. In criminology, it's known as the displacement effect of crime. And what happens is, in the first instance, and this is known as the first displacement, is you do what's called target hardening. So it means you increase your security, you increase your weapons, and you drive away opportunistic crime. So it's successful. But the second displacement, and this is key, is that it comes back, but more violent. So if we think of Maponya Mall, that the group that was approaching Maponya Mall, they assessed the situation, they were outnumbered, they were outgunned, and there's a standoff and they retreat. The issue is when they come back next time, they're going to know that we need numbers and we need more guns. And we've seen that right now. A warning went out this morning to all KZN police stations that they needed to increase their security on their armories because there was word that people who were unable to complete some of what was happening in KZN were wanting more weapons. And so that's a perfect example of the weapons effect, is that the weapon does act as a deterrent, but it's temporary. And what it does is the presence of weapons escalates the violence. And of course, it increases the risk for both serious injury and death. And we're hearing reports from Chris Hani Baragwanath about the number of gunshot victims that they've had to deal with in the last week. The third point and third observation that I want to make is, I think we all saw it, is the speed and the ease with which our society mobilizes violence against violence, in response to violence, or in response to a perception of the threat of violence. Rapid mobilization at community level. But not just that, if you look and do a kind of a bit of a scan of the social media, I mean, there wasn't a sense of, people we need to organize to prevent this. It's people we need to organize to fight. Get your guns and let's murder these guys. That's our language. That's the one thing we share, is the language of violence and how to mobilize violence in response to violence. And I mean, even taxi operators, suddenly have become heroes. For most of us, I think most people find, they're not the most liked people, even though they're providing an essential service. But suddenly you look at the Sunday Times joining the ranks of heroes. Okay. We know that taxi drivers often have illegal guns, but it's suddenly okay to mobilize the illegal guns to protect our property. But, don't use illegal guns to come and rob us. So there's this real kind of contradiction about how we mobilize for the use of guns and for what purpose. And in the end, with 337 people dead, the majority of them murdered. So the question, I guess the final in terms of our ability to mobilize violence is this the kind of society we want? Are we not able to mobilize earlier on holding our state to account on poor policing and weak policing, and to mobilize around a basic income grant? Because those are some of the two key kind of elements we need, that if that was in place, we wouldn't have been seeing some of what we saw over the last 10 days.
Adele, thank you very much indeed. Very lucid explanation, very detailed explanation of some of what happened. The issue of a basic income grant, of course, is something that's absolutely flowed from this, but a very interesting idea as well around taxi drivers. Thank you. Just a reminder, if you've got questions, if you don't, I don't know what to say, but if you do, please put them on the chat box. Just keep touching or hitting your screen until you see chat, and go from there, Q&A, and we'll put those through. And also just, get all the hashtags right if you are tweeting, if you can. Zianda Stuurman, good evening. We all know that without the conditions on the ground, youth unemployment, I mean, depending on which estimate you use, over 70% after the pandemic, certainly around, I think 56% was the sort of official figure, depending on which official figure you use before the pandemic. We know that we have the highest inequality in the world. We all know this. We see it, and we see it more and more driving around, walking around now. Obviously, this all provided fertile ground for what happened.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that, Stephen. And good evening to my fellow panelists and everyone who's out there watching and listening tonight. I think that so much of what happened over the last couple of days was not only sort of a decade in the making in terms of the lost decade of economic growth, particularly in South Africa due to President Zuma's or former President Zuma's tenure and state capture, but also really just speaks to the way that our society is built. It's still very, very close to what apartheid designed in terms of a society and an economy with a permanent underclass, and particularly a class of people who feel that they get up and work every day if they're lucky enough to even have a job, but are completely disenfranchised from the future of the economy and therefore feel disconnected from the future of the country. And it's really, really dangerous to have a large group of people who feel that way, because at any given moment, they can assess their lives and assess the country and really kind of ask themselves, what do I have to lose? What do I have to lose if I engage in violence? What do I have to lose if I, sort of go after criminal endeavors? And that huge disconnect between those of us who feel incredibly invested in the country and want to move forward in certain ways, and those of us who feel like they've been left behind, both by society, by the economy, and uncared for by government. That was always going to be a tinderbox that just kind of needed the right spark. And I don't like using the analogy of a ticking time bomb. I very much feel like that's kind of self-contained, and we can look at a part of our country and say, oh, they could go off at any moment in time. Because what that does is that it doesn't actually allow us as other citizens to ask, what are we doing to try and grow an economy, to try and create a society that brings in more people, that is more fair, that is more just, and really tries to sort of work forward from there. So I think that this moment was really that kind of rupture and a bubble burst for a lot of people who might have imagined that the country was fine, it could move forward. Eventually, some people would be, lifted out of poverty, and we could kind of get somewhere. So I'm a young millennial, and I say all the time, I'm very tired of living through sort of world-changing events, whether it's 9/11 or any sort of other, sort of mass global event. But I think what a moment that feels similar for me was really Fees Must Fall. That was also an enormous paradigm shift in understanding that, there was essentially a social contract or a promise made, particularly to young people, that education would be your way out of poverty. And that, really sort of turned out not to be true for quite a few people who, for whatever reason, can't finish their education and are saddled with debt. And that made us all in the country rethink and relook at, what higher education is, the purpose that it serves, and who it serves and who it leaves behind. And I think those are the exact same questions we need to be asking ourselves now, in the aftermath of the unrest. Who does our country serve? Who does it leave behind? Who does it harm? And who does it essentially benefit? And in asking those questions, a really important sort of part of the research and writing that I do, particularly on policing, I think those are the same questions we have to ask of the police. We were failed by our intelligence. We were failed by our police service. We were failed in terms of being forewarned of this happening, at least from a state security side. And so it then becomes really important to understand that the police response now, hugely late, first of all, but also is a wrong response. You now have the police going to Sebokeng, knocking on doors, going door by door and demanding receipts. My goodness, that is just for looted goods that are going to be destroyed. They even, they admitted that. So again, it's about asking, does that police service, are they making us safer? Were they, in their failure to act beforehand to stop a lot of this unrest, is what they're doing now going to help us in any way, shape, or forward going forward? And I don't want to live in a country where the police are now going door to door and they're taking, microwaves and small appliances from people and even confiscating looted food. How does that make me safer? It actually makes the situation worse. So it's also about really determining both what has happened on a social level and where our economy and our society has contributed, but at the very same time, the failures in our policing where they've contributed. And if we're going to be okay with how they're choosing to deal with the situation now. I'm not going to answer for everybody. Everybody obviously has their own personal opinion. I have my own. But those are, again, the sort of introspective questions that we need to ask ourselves, and not necessarily want to move immediately into this kumbaya, look at all of these videos of people cleaning up the street. That's great, fantastic. I'm so glad that people did that, but we need so much more going forward. And we need to do so much more to end the cycle, really, where we fail, the people in our society who are hardest hit, by unemployment, by poverty, by inequality, and very importantly, who are hardest hit by the COVID-19 lockdowns and everything that meant. So if I were to have a sort of overarching message, I think for what I was saying, or what I'm trying to say, is that so many of our problems in South Africa are not new. They were there during the Zuma years. They've been there during the 2.5 years we've had of Ramaphoria to a certain extent. And if we're not really going to strike at the heart of what causes this social unrest that lies there in wait, for instigators, from a certain faction of the ANC or from another part of or nefarious part of our society, then those triggers are going to stay there, and they can be weaponized and triggered and instigated by someone else too.
Zenda, can I pick up on something you said? I was struck by what you said about how the definition of a ticking time bomb, that description is so wrong. And I think that's really interesting. I don't know if you would have seen it. Johnny Steinberg wrote a piece in Business Day last week in which he used the phrase, and I'm paraphrasing, but my memory of it is that he said, in the white nightmare that a sort of violence by Black people would come to the suburbs came true for the first time. He spoke about the sort of 300-year-old nightmare of white people. I thought that was really interesting, because what it points to is a final understanding, perhaps, that this is one country with one group of people rather than sort of white on enclaves. And I use that phrase sort of politically and as a sort of identifier. I don't know if you have any view on that, the final realization that actually this is one country and that we're all in it together. And that goes into an argument about the value of a basic income grant might lie more in its universality. In other words, everyone gets it, than in anything else. I mean, I don't know if you have a sort of view, hearing this for the first time.
Yeah, no, and I think I would definitely agree with Steinberg's sort of characterization of exactly that. I think that so much of our lives are kind of organized around this fear of each other, that we're not just sort of strangers to each other, but that we're dangerous strangers. And that's why we have this gargantuan private security industry, right? And that's why we, constantly looking at our society, much of what Adele was saying, of mobilizing around violence and of having this very deep and intimate understanding of violence, that we're, that we say all the time, the police should have been doing more. They should have been doing X, they should have been doing Y. We should give them more money. What does that solve? What does that actually, sort of mean in a country that's as unequal as ours, to say, yes, let's arm the police. Yes, let's arm private security. Because what that is about really is about building those walls and saying that we're not one South Africa, that I have my version of South Africa that I'm happy with. And these become sort of very rude awakenings from that kind of fantasy, of being closed off from the rest of the country.
Thank you. Wandile Saklobo, you sort of know when you see him that you're going to talk about food and farms and probably rainfall. Wandile, I'd like to sort of, put a few things to you. Obviously, there were concerns last week. I think those concerns have gone to an extent of disruptions to food supply chains. Also, food prices. I mean, we know that it seems that there's been quite high food price inflation over the last few months. I mean, the people on the panel know far better than I, but I mean, there's a lot of history about revolution in food prices. What is your sort of outlook for the next little while?
Yeah, good evening to the colleagues that are joining us online. Stephen, I think I want to pick firstly on what happened in the food supply, what caused some of the fears that we had about the whole food discussion last week. Because I think this all began from after the president's address on July 12th, when he warned of the number of risks, and he said one of those could be the food security stuff. And I think maybe that might not have been a good way of phrasing it, because I think generally the key point to understand is that when it comes to these issues around food, South Africa is generally a food secure country at a national level. So we don't hear a lot about discussion about threats of running out of food and stuff like that. And I think that's what made a number of people to be a bit more nervous when they hear a lot about this stuff. And obviously, Stephen, when one talks about food security in our perspective, it's always you're looking at a range of issues. You're not just looking at availability and accessibility, but you're also looking at affordability, which I think links back to a number of points that came out of Zia's input, and also around nutrition, stability, and all of those things. But I think at the heart of last week, the key challenge that we observed briefly was around the closures of the major entrants like N2, N3. That's an important corridor for movement of products, not only to KZN, but also some of the things that we do import for our side. And I think that temporary closure was one of the major things that was a big worry. But also I think KZN being a little bit unstable was an important issue to observe for those in food industry. Because I mean, we have a large part of our sugar that is there. We have milk, we have poultry, those are some of the products. But I think importantly, one of the things that many people in Central South Africa were gonna feel if that unrest had been prolonged for longer was even on basic things like bread, because the major yeast that is used in South Africa is actually over there in Durban. We don't have any major yeast plants in Central South Africa. So it was those little things that were causing a bit of concerns. Because I think it's important to gain understanding that when you're thinking about food industry in general, there is really no province in South Africa that you would say it is an anchor of the country's food. If there's an unrest in one province, it could jeopardize the whole country. If one would want then to categorize this, I think such provinces that could be a heart of our food system will be Gauteng, Mpumalanga, Free State, and to an extent Limpopo. I would say that's where, if you were to think about it in that particular way. But food production in general in KZN, it isn't a key issue, but rather the corridors. But I think in the wake of that, you saw already, obviously, those fears that were displayed in the media, social media, and in the space. And I think the government's reaction on that was, while at the start it might have made people uneasy to say, okay, the government is also panicking about this issue, maybe it is a reality. But I think even that panic helped in a sense that there was a meeting that was held on a Thursday morning around about 8 or so with some of the ministers and the captains of the food industry. And I think after that meeting, there were 4 broad things that came out of it. The folks there decided to say, look, concentrated efforts on opening up this N2, N3, concentrated effort in ensuring that the security in the bakeries, in the mills, and all of the basic food supply processing plants. And that was deployed, and the state worked with private sector to make sure that that security was there by end of Thursday. And the other remarkable progress that I saw, and even efficiency, if one could use that, was actually from the DTI. Because now there was a view to say, look, suspend competition policy so that those that are packaging and processing food can share information. 2 hours later, after those decisions were made, that was already in place, and that helped a lot. And also increased security at the port of Durban. That assisted a great deal because it allowed some of the products that were still halfway being offloaded, like wheat, for example, by the time the unrest intensified, were able to make sure that all of those processes were done swiftly, and you minimized to an extent the cost of those activities there. And I think that, as I said, by the time we go at the end of Friday, July 16 last week, the food system was already somewhat, normalizing to an extent, but obviously not reaching all the parts of KZN, because there was a major damage that was done in the distribution houses and some of the warehouses. And I think the full impact of that to the communities in KZN and some small towns is something that is going to last for a while, because at the end of the day, some of this disruption being caused by some of the very challenging problems that Zia explained, but I think at the end of it, they end up also causing much more pain to the very same communities, because rebuilding some of this infrastructure and the investments that is needed and the decisions that are yet to be made by businesses, if they will go through with rebuilding some, those are some of the things that will have economic impact in those communities in KZN. But I would say the food system of the country in general, Stephen, it's pretty much more now fully normalized to an extent. And I guess the key thing really that we need to deal with when we emerge from this crisis, building on both points came up from Adele as well as Ziana, is to say, how do we address unemployment? How do we deal with the inequality? And how do we ensure that the levels of investments that are required for economic growth come through in the economy? And I think those are the fundamental questions. And obviously dealing, because even the basic income grant that you are raising, it needs to be funded somewhere. Where is the money going to come from? Those are the big questions that I think at the end, we will have to address all of those. Thanks, Darren.
Sure, thank you, Wandile. Just before you go to the fridge, I presume. I did just want to ask. So it's tempting, I think, in some ways, to sort of say, well, there was a spike in food prices and that caused the violence, right? Was there anything like that? I mean, it's useful to have the data. What we do know is that there was a dramatic drop in income over the last year because of COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown. Was there anything in the shorter term in terms of food prices that could be seen in any way to provoke this? I'm trying to sort of get it out of the argument, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, the answer there, Stephen, is no, because if you look at the food price inflation in South Africa long term, we spent the pandemic with food price inflation of averaging around about 4.8%. We are used to having, when we are in drought periods, 10.8% or so of the rate which prices are rising. So this was not an issue of just this moment. And I think that it's more what maybe the professor will speak about, David, and also some of the points that Zia spoke about more fundamentally. But in the food system, that was definitely not emerging from there, because even the food price that people maybe talk about now, looking forward on what the food industry is going to be, people will actually be seeing food price inflation softening for the next couple of months. That's what we're looking at now. So there is no risk in as far as food prices, and even the past few months, we're not really at the crucial levels that we haven't seen before.
Wandile Sehlolo, thanks very much. Professor David Everett, I mean, there's obviously an awful lot of politics and governance that goes into all of this. I did want to ask David about, so the levels of orchestration, the levels of organization, and then key to that really is a question of why didn't it spread to other provinces? Now, Gauteng and KZN, the two most populous provinces, they're two of the three biggest economies. They're both massive. There are all sorts of arguments put forward as to why those two provinces. I think some things people want to talk about, some things people don't want to talk about. I think some things people are scared of talking about. But I do want to ask, the level of orchestration of this and why didn't it spread? What does that tell us that it didn't spread?
I mean, all good questions. So let me start with what I think from a position of reasonable ignorance happened. Which can I apologize to people in the chat, because there are so many comments coming through that it's really difficult to keep up. And for all of those of my colleagues who are giving me a hard time, no, it's not water. Yes, it is a glass of red wine, and I apologize. It's a cold night, but I'm getting so much abuse on the cell phone. It's beyond belief. I mean, I think there've been three main attempted explanations, and I've been responsible for part of one of them. And that is, was this an insurrection that failed? And that's certainly how the president presented it. The Mbeki Foundation presented this as counter-revolution, which I guess you could see why that would be an argument. Many people have said this is sedition. Now, of those, only sedition exists in the penal code. So you can't be guilty of counter-revolution. In a court of law, you can be accused of it, or, you know, and I'm sure many of us will be or have been, but it's not a crime. And neither, oddly, in South Africa is insurrection. But sedition is, and sedition is ironically described in the shorter Oxford as a violent strife between two factions. So that kind of gives you a sense of immediately where we're heading. And then, of course, with a view to overthrowing the state. But I would add a fourth category that people are not talking about. And I do see people in the chat asking for kind of cause and analysis of what went on. And I think this is an act of treason. And I think we should begin to use the language of treason. I think that, I mean, I loved Zianda's input and those of Adele and my colleague, Wandile, but how many poor people on the basis of their ethics said, I don't loot, I'm not going, this is just wrong, I'm not doing it. I don't care if people have told me I won't get caught, it's morally or ethically wrong. And there must be millions of poor, cold, starving people in those areas where the violence happened who said, this is wrong, I will not do it. So I really think we need to be in a space where we totally take on board Zianda's argument, but don't make it a kind of, oh, the poor had a legitimate reason to rise up, because they didn't all rise up. Many are guided by very strong senses of ethics and so on, and deliberately did not do so, and then became the guards of the malls once it became safe to do so. So I think we need, I'm not in any way disputing Zianda's argument, because I think it's spot on, but I think it's nuanced. So let's not just paint the poor that way. But I think very clearly what was happening was that you needed a trigger. Goes to your question, Stephen. The trigger was, without question, Zuma being put into prison. I don't think any of us imagined that, although many of us in civil society were calling for people to be wearing the orange uniforms, I don't think any of us thought that Zuma would be the first person to put one on. Whether you're happy about that or not depends on your politics. I leave that to you. But there was clearly celebration in some quarters and possibly commiseration in others. But I think the game was very clear. I mean, once he, at the very last minute, gives himself up, you immediately start trying to destabilize the state. And so so on the one hand, you do have very poor, hungry, and it should be said cold people, you know, who are told, if you go to this mall, there will be no consequences. Whether you're stealing frozen chicken or a 53-inch television, no one's going to touch you, even if it doesn't fit in your car. And we've all seen that video of that poor man trying to fit his stolen TV into a small car. Steal a bigger car, I think, is the answer. And so, you know, when you hear the Peter Maritzburg Chamber of Commerce talk, I think it was them, talking about the incredible sophistication with which malls were opened to start with. Just, malls are very secure at night when they're locked up. Then all security cameras were taken. Then the recordings was taken, and then the backups of the recordings were taken. Now, this means someone very sophisticated is playing this game, because they know exactly where to go in order to hide their footprint, in order to then go for the high profile, I mean, the high cost items. Let the poor be your kind of smokescreen. Look at all these terrible people running around stealing, you know, food and whatever it is that they're stealing. Well, on the other end, you've got some very sophisticated syndicates robbing malls absolutely blind, particularly, and this would be Adele's point, of weapons and ammunition. And then behind them, you have a political angle, which is, if we can shake the state enough, we can begin to, and that's your point about why didn't it spread. So if we can get the whole country to begin to feel destabilized, uncomfortable, this isn't, you know, violent, you know, it's not working. Well, we, as the Ret faction, will say, well, if only you would release former President Zuma, all of this would go. The concomitant side of that is, and of course, President Ramaphosa will have to stand down because he's lost control. And so no one said the word coup d'etat, but it's a very neat way of doing a coup, which is just get the poor to kind of cause a lot of problems by guaranteeing them security, not because they're going to do this by some kind of failed morality. They're not the undeserving poor. They merely happen to be poor. And so you get them to rattle the state, and you hope that behind that, you're able to engineer. It's almost Trumpian, with his fantasies about coming back into being president. You can engineer a situation where your first prize is Ramaphosa out of power, because Ramaphosa has made institutions work again. That's why Jacob Zuma is in prison. It's because the justice cluster is working. I totally agree with everyone who has said the security cluster completely missing in action. But we wouldn't be here if the justice cluster was not working and Jacob Zuma was not in prison. So let's just accept that the state is slowly getting its act together. We'd all wanted to be faster. We'd all wanted to be better. We'd always wanted to be perfect. It's not, but it is working. And so I think what you had was a situation where, on the basis of Zuma playing, and the foundation and the family and all the rest of the hangers-on, playing the Zulu ethnic nationalist card, you can certainly destabilize a province. And if you destabilize KZN, you will, without question, destabilize the hostels in Johannesburg. We see this when there's xenophobic violence. We see this every time anything happens in KZN. It happens in George Goch and Denver and the others that are down near Jewel Street. And that happened. Surprise, surprise. The hostels are run by Izinduna. And I know this from listening to the Premier giving us the provincial address, in which he said he's in daily, if not hourly, contact with the Induna in the hostels to try and stop this violence happening. And so I think there are layers going on here, and you can pick your area of focus and interest. But I think if you don't see it as a big, complicated mess, you're in danger of missing the very complicated messiness of it. But I think it's vital that we understand, to my mind, and I'm happy to be shouted down, but to my mind, this was an overt attempt by those who have only two choices, which is destabilize the country and keep me out of jail, or I'm in jail. That's the choice they face now, because the justice cluster is after them. We've seen Ace Magashule out of the ANC and in the dock in court. Carl Niehaus out of the ANC. The list goes on. So the noose is tightening. And as the noose gets tighter, the stakes rise or raise. And the violence, of course, is unleashed because, as Ayanda made the point, and so did Adele, we've got 400 years of teaching each other that violence is the way you sort out your problems, particularly if you're black, a shambok, a gun, or whatever. But violence will be the solution. It won't be discussion. It won't be taking tea together. And so I think, it's those successive layers. But I worry that if we focus too much on the poor, they were almost the smokescreen behind which all of these other players, including the criminal syndicates, but particularly the political syndicates, were playing their games. So I think that would be my take on both what happened and why it didn't spread. What interest does Northwest have in Zulu nationalism? Nothing. Or Mpumalanga or Limpopo or anywhere else. It doesn't matter. The only place where there's a large proportion of Zulu-speaking people living directly next to each other is the hostels in Johannesburg, and that's where it spread to.
David, can I ask, just as a sort of follow-up? I mean, we obviously, I think, all except the arrest of Zuma was the trigger point, must have been. Do you think they have the power to do it again? I mean, if they've now, if on your version, people have been able to access money, access resources, steal what they stole, does it make it easier to try it again?
It's really good. I mean, I yes. So, I mean, I think what we saw was from the playbook of any quasi-revolutionary movement, and it's also the playbook from Die Hard 4, if you really want, which is knock out the infrastructure. Poor people do not attack cell phone towers, and yet they were attacked. Poor people do not attack community radio stations, and yet they were attacked. Poor people do not attack reservoirs, but they were attacked, as were electricity substations. And so when you put all of that into the mix, I think you get a very different picture of what's going on than the one that we're being presented with. Can it happen again? I suspect that was a fairly sophisticated I use very strong quotation marks, that was the attempt at a genuine overthrow of Ramaphosa. I think without question, and I think Adele described very well the extent to which we've become, violence is our first. It's not the last thing we go for. It's the first thing we go for is, can I clap you? And if not, okay, let's talk, because we've reached an impasse. And I think in that sense, it could very, very easily happen again. And if you take what Zianda was, the point she was making about poverty, the points my colleague Wandile was making, there are, the vast majority of people remain poor, they remain hungry. In this ridiculous weather, they remain absolutely freezing. And this was an opportunity that was presented to them as loot without consequence. If that is offered again, I'm sure there are people who will take it. We all saw the street kids who have nothing to lose, aimlessly throwing bricks at kind of shuttered windows in the hope that maybe, and one of them threw a brick into his mate's face, which of course is when you get your news off TikTok. But I think the possibility of this exploding again is there, but not with this level of sophistication in the short term, is my guess. But I'm not a securocrat. I'm just a sad academic. So who am I to say?
David, Everett, thanks very much indeed. All right, we've got tons of questions, loads of questions actually coming through on the chat box. When I look down, I'm looking at my phone because they're being sent to me there, but keep please sending them through on the Q&A session. There are obviously huge conversations around so many things. So Takani asks, is this discussion all aimed at focusing on the livelihoods and mindsets of those who looted? Is it purely focused on the cost to society? Society has cushioned colonialism into its moral fiber. It's not possible to adequately weigh the cost to society without trying to understand the impacts of years of oppression and our subpar attempts at bridging the gap. I think Zianda Stearman, if I may sort of put some of that to you. In a way, from the 1990s, we had this aspiration of what we wanted the country to be. We know that it is nothing like that. There are lots of reasons why it's not like that. But I mean, this must be true that colonialism is still absolutely with us in South Africa today.
Yeah, no, I definitely, wouldn't argue against that. I think that almost any sort of sector or part of South African society or the economy and governance as well is deeply affected by the history of colonialism, of apartheid, and of 2.5 decades at this point of sort of neoliberal economics. I think that this is a really great question because it also sums up the just centuries of history that our transition to democracy came up against. There was obviously a lot of hope and a lot of optimism, in that time, but I think that we also lost an opportunity for incredibly kind of radical and decisive change from what we'd had before. And that question, I can imagine, sort of gets the hairs up on some people's necks. But if you think about just how radical the inequality of this country was as we were coming out of centuries again of colonialism and colonial exploitation and apartheid, the answer to that had to be just as radical, just as intense and excavating, so much of the violence and the racism and the exploitation that existed in our society. I think we largely failed to do that then in the sort of late 90s going into the 2000s, and we're still seeing the ripple effects of not properly being able to build a South Africa and build a South African economy again that doesn't lock people out of it or depend on the sort of huge exploited class of people sort of just under the surface.
There, thank you. Adele, I think I'll put this to you, but this comes from Anonymous. I'm always a bit nervous about asking questions of people who are anonymous. Just go onto Twitter under the fake avatar like the rest of us. You say, in the past, foreign nationals' shops were looted and burned down, and we've seen this happen so many times. However, the reaction of authorities was light, to say the least. Were looters of foreign-owned shops ever arrested and prosecuted? And I think this is a really interesting question because could that explain partly what happened last week, if there's a culture of impunity? And I mean, at the very beginning of last week, it seemed, and I mean, by the very beginning, I mean sort of 10 days ago now, it seemed that there were one or two resonances with the anti-foreign national violence, the xenophobic violence that we've seen. And then it changed. But the point of impunity, that this kind of violence, looting of shops has happened, hasn't been punished. Did that play a role in this, do you think, Adele?
I think, Stephen, I guess to say two things is to look at the issue of xenophobic attacks. In a research project that I helped direct 10 years ago, it's called The Smoke That Calls, and it looked at insurgent citizenship and community protest. In fact, and it was 7 communities across Gauteng and Mpumalanga, and there's a different story there, that for many of the young protests in particular, in fact, the reason we called the research project The Smoke That Calls was it was a direct quote from one of the young protesters who said, "The Premier will know that we are calling him by the smoke. So if we burn a library, etc., that's when premiers come. That's when they take notice." And the reason I'm raising this is because the other comment was, if we loot a foreign national's shop, they also come. And so there was the sense of grievance, not only of the narrative that foreign nationals have taken our job, but if we want SAPS and our provincial government to pay attention to us, we need to torch or loot a shop owned by a foreign national. So that's another way in. And another experience of people in communities. I mean, in terms of impunity, we know, I mean, it's like, to the highest office in the land, right down, that our criminal justice system is weak. And even though I know David said that if it's still functioning because Zuma is in jail, but I think it's a sense that it is implemented and used differently depending on who you are. And again, for many people who are poor, marginalized, excluded from our society at so many levels, they are also excluded from getting justice through effective policing and through bringing people. I mean, you hear so many stories of communities talking about someone being arrested and 2 days later they out on bail. And of course, what we're dealing with here is the rule of law, is that if you don't have sufficient evidence against someone, you need to release them. But it's about a really weak criminal justice system on the ground for most of us, I think, for regular people.
Goes back once again, I think, to the opening statement. I forget who made it. That a weak state, you have higher levels of violence in a weak state. Adele, it might have been you, Zianda, it might have been you. I'm not sure.
The violence, it's yeah.
I mean, it certainly makes sense. Marizia is asking, in line with Adele's comment about displacement. In other words, crime comes back, but more violently. And I think you used the example of, people at a shopping center coming to loot it, seeing people there protecting it, so they come back with more people. The sort of second displacement, I think, was the way that you described it. I mean, how do we create a situation in which this dissipates? And obviously, we can talk about the basic income grant, and I do want to come to you a little bit in a minute on that. But Adele, how do we stop? How do we try and dissipate this risk? And I mean, the most likely state response to this is probably to increase the number of police officers yet again. And the response of people in middle class areas is most likely to, have 2 security companies, not 1. That's not going to be the response that stops this.
Yeah. So I think 2 things. One is we have to kick it upstream. So in a country with, and I mean, a lot of people on the chat are talking about the kind of trio of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. These are deep underlying social problems in our society. If we don't deal with that, and we know these are long-term and they will take time to take effect, but that's why they are urgent. So we have to kick this can upstream. These are absolutely essential issues to address. at the other level, the kind of systemic weaknesses within our security cluster, and in particular within SAPS. The issue isn't more money and more people. I know from the work that the ISS does is that we've got the resources. It's around understanding what the mandate is. And I know we like to go to training and all of that kind of stuff, but it's really about having a plan about how to do policing, and there isn't a plan. You know, Tina Jumat-Peterson was, you know, they did an oversight visit the portfolio committee 2 days ago in KZN. And the knee-jerk response is, we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough cops, and we don't have enough money because our budget's been cut. That is not true, and it's not a helpful response. And again, we know that turning the police around is a lot of work and long-term work, but unless we do those two things, we will continue because the same underlying conditions exist. Having said that, though, if we see of some of the response, which is about communities coming together to protect what they regard as their assets, are there things we can learn from that about communities working through CPFs, working with each other to safeguard communities? But at the moment, what we are seeing is the kind of unevenness of that, of really kind of class and race-based organizing. And I think I feel like that's a whole area that certainly from my side haven't looked at carefully enough. And I think just to say that Nuran Tulsi has written a really interesting piece in the New Frame today, where he combines his own personal story and where he then provides a really kind of overview of what happened. And similar to what David is saying, is he tracks 3 kind of moments in the looting where the kind of strong men come and they open up the malls, and then people come in and take what they need, and then at night the bakkies and SUVs come with taking the TVs and the kind of you know, electronic goods. And so there are all these layers about, you know, who is involved in this and what is being facilitated. And so I think, and I guess this is one of the kind of narratives to challenge, is we just calling this looters. Everyone is a looter. And there's no kind of, I guess, layering of what does that mean? And in a way, I guess from our perspective, it's a bit of an othering. And that othering means that looters can be shot and killed because actually they have, their life has less value than those of us trying to protect our property.
Adele, thank you. Zianda, I want to put, I'm in 2 minds at the moment about a basic income grant in this violence. Let me just explain what I mean. Up until sort of this point, to a large extent, I've been following the debate around the basic income grant. It's been going on for 20 years at least. Recently sort of got new features related to COVID-19. Business Day, I think, said yesterday they expect a new grant from the president soon. And this is clearly a response to the violence because it wasn't on the agenda from what I could see, even though there was a little bit of pressure when we went back into lockdown level 4 for a new grant or for another TERS, but certainly something different. It seems the basic income grants is an idea whose time maybe in South Africa has finally come. And I sort of agree with the idea. I was talking to Isabel Fry, I think, on the radio yesterday. It's SFM 104 to 107, 6 to 9 in the morning. And she was saying that there's a sort of universality to it that would include everyone in society. And I was very struck by that idea. I thought that was really interesting. I think for more privileged people, I suppose, like myself, you know, the argument you could make to them is you're going to sleep better at night if you pay just a little bit more, and nothing is worth a good night's sleep. You can't sort of value that. And I think that's partially true. But then I'm also struck with David Everett's point tonight about how organized and orchestrated this was. And I don't know if we're up against that level of orchestration, would a basic income grant really stop what happened? And then I suppose the immediate response to my question, Zianda, might well be, but Stephen, we don't need to have violence to have a conversation around the basic income grant. We should have one anyway, perhaps. Anyway, your thoughts, Zianda Stuurman.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that they're important parallel questions or conversations to have and to be asking. I think that the ultimate value of a basic income grant really becomes about understanding that obviously being alive costs money, right? That we live in a country again where people are very barely sort of holding on and being able to eke out a living in lots of informal ways and through other sort of state subsidies. But at the end of the day, it is really quite expensive just to sort of be alive. And then you add on top of that to try and care for a child or a family member, for example. And then you add on top of that trying to look for work, which is a job in and of itself and an expense in and of itself. So what helps with the basic income grant is, yes, on the sort of bigger philosophical scale, it is that universality and brings everybody into this idea of South Africa and of a caring society and government, but at the same time meets people's really basic needs that I think for too long have kind of politicians or whoever have said, well, people still find ways to make do. And I think that certainly a sort of a basic income grant would help in that way. I think it's also useful to think of a basic income grant as part of a suite deck of options. Again, this emerged during COVID-19, but the People's Coalition, which is a sort of group of civil society organizations, came together and they tried to cost various plans that would help. So a basic income grant was one of them. The other was a 100-day jobs guarantee. And that's, about, again, trying to put people into productive work, whether it's large scale infrastructure programs or other programs that are run by government, early childhood development, et cetera, that then gives people work, gainful employment, and at the same time, they're able to go home with something. Similar to caregivers grants or caregiver top-up grants. Again, we had a country, and we have a country where a lot of people are sick even before COVID. And so that precludes quite a few people, particularly women, from being able to enter the job market, because they have to care for family members or children, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the BIG, and the idea for a BIG is certainly one part of it. And I think that what this moment calls for us to do is to really kind of look at various options that are out there, the BIG being one of them, but others that are useful as well. And just to make one final point on this sort of idea of a BIG and budgets and money, I very much agree with what Adele was saying, in terms of the sort of immediate responses. The police need more money, they need more this, they need more that. In the last 2 years, we spent 95 billion Rand and 99 billion Rand on the police budget. Where did that money go? I'm super curious if anybody in the comments has ever actually read, an annual report by the police and has line items and understands that, because that's where we should be asking, where's the money going for policing? Why isn't it working? Why is there a huge chasm between the way we experience policing and how much we spend on it? And then we can start really asking, why aren't the police preventing crime? Why is that not a huge part of what they're doing in their mandates? And that complicates then the question of, we should be pouring more money into a police service, because why pour more money into it if we can't see any real tangible value from what we're getting?
But how can you have a VIP protection unit without a police service, Yanda? You make such an interesting point. Wandile Sehlobo, for, I can't even remember, I think it was one dark, warm night in 2019, Tito Mboweni out of nowhere released a set of treasury proposals that were going to grow the economy. One of them involved tourism, and we're just going to, for the rest of the conversation, I'm afraid, remove tourism from the conversation because it can't help us. But the other conversation was that agriculture could be a way to create jobs, to get income. And one of the things that we've seen, I mean, Newsroom Africa had Channel 405 on DSTV, had reporters in Bergville on the way down to the N3, and you saw how people there just had no form of income whatsoever. Agriculture is something that could work there. Is it possible that agriculture could really make a difference? Or is the market, the way the industry works around the world, uses far fewer people than it used to? It just doesn't work like that anymore.
Yeah, Stephen, I want to use also this opportunity while I'm on the floor to put one question to my colleague, David. The first one, not to David Bese, but just generally on this comment. I think when we talk about the basic income grant, we need to also clarify about how are we going to fund this. And I think we need to do a lot of work in there. My colleague Azaya Mhlanga he has a column out in Business Day this evening where he lays out some scenarios on that end. And I do think that we need to be careful about how we deal with that conversation. It is necessary, crucial for South Africa, but I think we need to think deeply about the funding of it. But also, to your point, before going to the point I want to raise to David, I mean, agriculture, yes, there is an opportunity to grow the sector, expand and create jobs and everything. There are prospects there. And I think the absorption of people, particularly those who are in a less skilled sector, we do have a capacity at which we could create closer to 1 million jobs or so in agriculture. So, but there are certain prerequisites that needs to be done, and that lies part on the state. It starts with infrastructure, it starts with land, it goes to security that needs to be addressed. So there's a number of things that needs to be laid out to achieve that goal. And I guess the other one, then it ties on with the point that on the backdrop of what David explained about the intricacies and the sophistication of this, if you are now sitting in the private sector, you are looking at putting money so that there could be some economic activity, jobs to come in. What signals should we look for to see that the state has managed to close off all of these pain points that could cause instability? Because what could I tell now some of the folks that are in agriculture about KZN? Are you comfortable to say, look, put all of these big infrastructure in this area? How certain are you about the prospects of the other hundreds? What are those key things that we should look for? But to your question, Stephen, there's a lot of prerequisites that needs to be attended to, but the potential is there.
I suppose having potential is an important thing. David Everett, there have been one or two sort of questions, one or two issues that sort of have come up that I've been looking at putting to you. Zama Moyo asks, to David, if indeed we can put down the violent looting to sedition and treason in particular, what are the implications for the security cluster's approach, both in quelling any further outbreaks, but also for securing the country going forward, and given particularly the socio-economic profile of South Africa? And I mean, feel free to say whatever you like about the State Security Agency, because man, oh man, there's nothing good to say about it.
I think even if I said it on this platform and wherever we are, YouTube, or they wouldn't know. So I'm not worried. I think treason is, let me just say that I'm married to a lawyer, so I claim none of this intelligence. I made her tell me over supper what the argument was. But, the penal code classifies treason as high treason, Guy Fawkes and all that stuff. But if you are attempting an armed overthrow of the state, in other words, you're fomenting, you're organizing, and you're using the poor as your kind of battering ram, as you like, but behind it you have these layers of sophistication. I think it means that the security cluster is so out of its depth it doesn't know where it is. So I do think the justice cluster is working well, and I don't necessarily agree with Adele on that one. I mean, I do think that the NPA has been got new head, got new middle, got new budget, as do the Hawks, as do various others. I think SAPS is your real problem. I think it's full of dead wood. It seems to spend its entire life at leadership level fighting over who can be closer to criminal gangs than anyone else, and can we get you out the way? Sorry, I'm going to get shot for this. Sorry, I mustn't say shot in front of Adele, I know, because I'll get stabbed. There you go, it's better. There's no guns involved. But I think that if you want to understand this, you can. It's kind of like the way a magician works. It's misdirection. It's like, look at this hand, and I'm swapping the coin in this one. So you can look at all the poor, and you can, as Zianda said, you can really hammer them. You can say, we're going to arrest every one of them. We're going to take back the fridge, freezer, whatever it is that you took, even down to the frozen kind of piece of chicken that you took. what on earth are you going to achieve by doing that? You're going to harm the poor even more than they're already in trouble. You know, the security cluster needs to say, was or was this not, through a rational process of engaging the evidence. And it's the Minister of State Security who came out and said, we foiled attacks on electricity substations. So it's not like they don't know, or at least don't claim to know, let me put it that way. So if they're sitting on the intelligence, why the hell are they not acting on it? That's the real question. Because in order to stop an attack on a substation, anyone who's been vaguely or has watched Die Hard 4, my favorite reference point in this, attacking a substation is not something you do somewhere, you know, just off the cuff. It takes planning, it takes sophistication, it takes technical know-how, it takes people on the inside. You've got to develop your assets so that you can find your way in, all that stuff. So if Ayanda Dlodlo's people were in there, why on earth didn't they stop this? Why on earth didn't they raise the red flag earlier? There must have been a signal that says go. And the security cluster claims that they were in there and stopping it. And yet they seem to be completely at sea when it says, why did it happen? How did it happen? Who's responsible? So we're told there are 12 instigators. Really? One of them's a DJ who handed himself over to the police, and they went, well, we don't really want you. Please, but we'll hold you because you might be a flight risk. I mean, come on. You know, so I think the danger of this, to get to the second part of your question, I hope, is that we are, the more we talk as a panel and people across the country about, you know, is it sedition, is it treason, is it this, is it insurrection, you begin to give the state a narrative on which they can use to hide their own mistakes and faults. So, oh, well, how are we supposed to know if there's a conspiracy? Because conspiracies obviously happen in the dark and we don't tell anyone about them. So it's not our fault that we didn't know. Ayanda Dlodlo's evidence notwithstanding, you know, how are we supposed to know about all of these things? Don't blame us. It was an attempt by those bad Zuma people to try and overthrow the state. And so while I do believe it was exactly that, that in no way lets the state off the hook for absolutely failing to know that it was happening, to predict it. I mean, they knew Zuma was either going to go or there was going to be warfare at Nkandla. There were only two ways out. They were both going to be violent. I mean, let's be frank, you know, that night that he was either going to hand himself over, in which case what we saw happened would happen, or he wouldn't, in which case it would all have happened around Nkandla. Don't forget, between 2000 and 2009, I think it was, the police reported that 20,000 weapons were stolen from different police stations. Arthur Fraser, when he was head of state security, admitted that a whole cache of weapons had vanished from the state security agency. We have a regiment that was trained in both China and Russia that has somehow been inveigled into the security forces and the state security agency without any vetting, without any application process. All happened under the Zuma regime. And so all I'm trying to do is say, in the same way as Pravin Gordon, when he was talking about state capture, said, you know, join the dots. The big danger is you join the wrong dots and you end up in kind of cloud cuckoo land where you've got, you know, all sorts of conspiracy theories. But I think if you join some very simple dots, you end up in a situation where the state, particularly the security end of the state, failed lamentably. And that's because the state, I think, is at war with the state. And I think we treat the state as monolithic, and we're wrong in doing that. In the same way as Zuma is heavens, Ramaphosa is trying to transform parts of the state. He's succeeding, and he's facing enormous resistance from the same state that he's trying to transform. The same is true. I'm seeing the chat going on and on about the ANC. And I agree. This is an ANC fight that has spilled over into the state and now spilled over into our lives. And it all comes from the original definition of insurrection, which is faction fighting with an eye to ultimate victory through arms. And so I think in that way, we have to keep the state accountable. I mean, Adele talked a lot about the rule of law, but accountability is vital. And the game here is, if you destabilize the state, there's no real clear vision. Everything is kind of murky and in half light, and impunity thrives there. As soon as things are stable and settled and predictable, impunity has no place. And that's the game that's being played. And what's most important for us as citizens and residents, because many people live in South Africa who are not citizens, but have the right to be here. I see the xenophobic comments, xenophobia issues coming up in the chat. I think it's vital that we understand that for them and for us, what we want is normality, predictability, in fact, a boring life that tries to help the people that Zianda and Wandile were talking about, while not letting the state say, well, it's not our fault, we never knew. How would you know? It's a conspiracy, don't blame us. And I think that's where they're heading, and it's a very, very worrying space for them to try and occupy.
Sure. Okay, we've got 10 minutes left. Wandile, I do want to put a question. It's from Daniel, who asks, what should the role of government be in making reparations for losses, particularly through SASRIA, the South African Specialist Insurance Association? So this is about insurance payouts for damage and business interruption. Should indemnification be extended beyond those who are insured into those who do not have insurance? In other words, I think to sum up Daniel's question, should companies that are not insured be paid out by SASRIA, and how important insurance is generally to the sort of rebuilding of KZN, Wandile?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to have to be careful there, because I mean, it's not something that I think about a lot. But I imagine insurance companies will deal with those that are insured. But then the question is, say, those that were not insured, should the state intervene? Does the state have the money? And it was in those bases, even when I was commenting on the issue of the basic income grant, to say these are all necessary and important things, but we have to think about the source of revenue or funding some of these options. And I guess that's going to be one of the contentious points, because now if you were to start to say, okay, you are popping a lot of money saving businesses, the argument that may well has come from societies to say, okay, you are giving money to these businesses, what about the poor that needs to be supported? So how do you make those trade-offs is going to be very difficult for me. And I guess it leads Stephen back to the point that I wanted my colleague David, I'm going to have to catch him after this webinar, to say, what should the businesses look for to see that there is that improvement? What should be those indicators that they need to watch? Because at the end of the day, to come out of Zianda as an issue about people being in despair, not out of work, you need business activity, you need employment to happen. At a potential, it is there, but there's certain step and prerequisites, both by government and also by state, that needs to fall in place for all of that to happen. But to the question you had raised, I don't know if the state will really be able to pay and cover those business. I really don't.
Okay, it's sort of final comment time, I'm afraid. As Zianda, I'm going to ask you to start. The question, I suppose, is, what is your outlook? What do you think happens next? Do you think, and Zianda, I'll give you literally 2 minutes, good luck with that. Do you think we're going to get a basic income grant? Do you think it'll make a difference? If we don't get a basic income grant, with expectations now raised that we will get one, could that be another trigger event of some kind? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that we'll probably come close to a basic income grant. Again, this isn't the first time in very recent history that we've sort of spoken about this. Lindiwe Zulu, Minister of Social Development, spoke about this about a year ago when the sort of COVID pandemic started. So I don't know what it will look like, because we also have a finance minister who is very committed to the project of austerity. So I'm not convinced that we're going to have, a BIG in the way that civil society hopes for. We might see some sort of extension of the social relief distress grant, the 350 Rand grant. But I'm not sure that, there's a sort of wide range of possibilities. If I'm sort of thinking of outlook, and this is where I'm going to step on David's toes ever so slightly, but if I'm looking at a sort of outlook or thinking about an outlook, I can't help but also think of recent ANC history, and this being in 2016, when Thoko Didiza was parachuted in as a mayoral candidate for Tshwane, and we saw that city go up in flames, because the faction of Sputla Ramakgopa rejected her candidacy. I'm very worried about what we're going to see in the run-up to the elections. They might happen in October, they might happen in February next year, but there's always incredible amounts of competition and competitiveness that come with those positions, because they do give access to public funds and a patronage network. The sort of Ramaphosa supporters in that year were able to draw some sort of concessions, in the sense that Ramaphosa became the leader of the opposition. And I wouldn't be surprised, Ntwane, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something along those lines, maybe hyper-localized, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that factionalism spill out into the streets again. And that is worrying for me as a sort of short to medium term outlook.
Adele, a final thought from you, if I may. The question, of course, comes around, if we don't strengthen the state, what we saw in Phoenix, the chances of that happening again will grow. Adele, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, I'm afraid.
Sorry, thanks.
There you are.
So, I mean, I think it's not just a case of strengthening the state. I think it is also about strengthening kind of social relations between each other. I think we have high levels of distrust. So the sense that when someone is walking down the street or is coming in a car, and because of the context and high levels of crime, our first response is, this person is a danger to me, I need to defend, I need to fight back. So a kind of hyper-vigilance and hyper-alertness to respond in often aggressive ways. So it's about finding ways to rebuild trust with each other and within communities, not just across communities. I think the one thing that we could, or most of us, or many of us could get behind, is beginning to say, what is the kind of police that we want? There's a lot of work, someone like David Bruce has done a lot of work on the police we deserve. I mean, is there kind of a joint project that we can get together and say, this is the kind of police we want? We've seen it in Khayelitsha with the Khayelitsha Commission and the Social Justice Coalition. Is this something which we can mobilize each other together and develop some kind of plan of, this is the kind of police we want, this is the kind of police we deserve?
Thank you. David Everett, the short-term outlook for our politics. I mean, I've seen some people suggest that, in a way, this strengthens Ramaphosa. There's no way he can pardon Zuma now, right? David Everett?
Sorry, Stephen, my Wi-Fi has been playing up. Could you repeat?
My question was short-term outlook for our politics. I mean, I've seen some people suggest that this strengthens Ramaphosa. There's no way that he could pardon Zuma now, that's for sure, I would think.
God, you'd hope not. I mean, I know nothing about politics, and so I'm happy to speak from a position of profound ignorance. I mean, I think that this was one of the last throws of the dice from the anti-Ramaphosa faction, because he has maneuvered himself, and dare I say that some of my earlier articles in the conversation said, I told you so, but we all kind of said at the beginning of his presidency, this is going to be a slow chess match. This is not going to be fireworks, blood on the floor, heads on pikes, all the kind of revenge that we want for 50 billion rand being stolen from the state. And so when we talk about, and I see the chat in the column about, oh, the middle class must pay, and oh, where's the money going to come from? Well, we've lost 50 billion rand, and the money is going to have to come from somewhere, because poor people have to eat, and they have the right to eat. And I think until the middle class get out of their little bubble of feeling victimized and, oh, we must be taxed, and oh, it's our fault. No, it's not. It's about trying to create a decent society where everyone has an equal chance of fulfilling their lives and their children's lives. And how anyone could object to that by paying a few more rands on their taxes is just beyond me. And so I think in terms of the politics of it, it seems to me that what this has done, so long as the president plays his cards right, he's emerged as the most genuinely committed and democratic president we've had in a while, as in the last decade. He's strengthening the state. He's moving against the enemies of the state. And he's trying to put us back on a track where we know where we're going and we can begin to worry about Wandile's confidence signals to the private sector. We're also be able to talk to the poor meaningfully with a social grant, a basic income grant that actually puts food in people's stomachs. And I really worry when I see comments in that chat thing saying, oh, it's just moving the goalposts, oh, it's of time. No, it's not. The difference between starving and eating is fundamental. And if we don't accept that these are things that we are morally obliged to do, and if you're not religious, then you're ethically obliged to do, then I'm not sure why we're having this conversation at all, because clearly people don't want to be part of the society. But for the society to work, some people have to give up stuff. And that's generally us, the white middle class that benefited so handsomely from the past. We do have to give up stuff. That's how it works, so that other people can join us in this middle class status with all these lovely things, while people in shacks don't even have electricity and couldn't give a damn when they switch off the power, because it makes no difference to their lives. And so I think there's a little bit of realism, a little bit less self-pity from the middle classes, a little bit more empathy for the working classes and the non-working poor. And I think we might begin to find a space in which we are able to say, we went through this together. It's not a kumbaya to clean it up. I agree with, I think it was Adele who made that point. You know, this isn't a great moment of nation building, but it can be a really important moment, because when you and I are knee deep in the muck cleaning it up, we are building something that we would not have built before, because I wouldn't have met you. And it's only because we live in the same neighborhood that we're, and whether we're Black, white, Indian, Muslim, Christian, I don't care. We're there cleaning it up. And I think from those one-on-one relationships, you can begin to build something that can withstand any future attack on the democracy.
David Everett, thank you. Wandile, final word to an economist appropriately. It is about food. The short term, obviously, is to restore economic confidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I wouldn't even want to trump it with economic statistics, but I think building on David's point, we all have, most of us, at least in this podcast, have green passports. So we have to try to make the country work. And I think that will need those relations that Adele was relating to, both of us, government, private sector, and as citizens, to working together to take what are the solutions. And I guess then those that are in economics, we have to be thinking deeply about the sources of growth and how in the near term we could be able to do that, so that as many people as possible, regardless of the level of education, at least there could be a space for them to be absorbed in the labor market and begin to have some bit of hope. And I think through those efforts, we could be able to have some bit of stability. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Wandile Sekloboy, agricultural economist at AgBriz. Thanks very much indeed. Zianda Stuurman, in looking at poverty, I really appreciate the time. Adele Thurston, for your contribution. Thank you very much indeed. And Professor David Everett, East Head of the School of Governance. Thank you. And then Professor Imran Valodia and Kim Jurgensen, thank you very much indeed for arranging it. I really do appreciate that. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm afraid there's probably a lot more discussions about our future to come. I think we still need to find out a lot more about what actually happened to get to the bottom of it. And let's hope that stage 2 load shedding is the last that we have of it. I can't make any promises that it will be. You'll have to speak to my former friend, Supanati Manchansha. Try and stay warm and stay safe. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Good night.
Good night.